The air was thick with smoke and fear. Villagers crowded around the pit, their faces glowing orange from the embers below. At the center lay a shallow trench filled with millet grains, now burning red-hot, the husks snapping and crackling like angry tongues of fire. The heat warped the air, and every breath carried the scent of scorched earth. Two men dragged a young woman forward, her wrists bound, her feet bare against the dust. Her head was bowed, black braids falling loose over her face, but her eyes, when she lifted them, shone with a strange calm. She was no witch, no bringer of curses, but the whispers of envy had grown louder than truth. "Let her prove herself," the stepmother hissed from the crowd, her voice sharp as thorns. "If she is pure, the fire will not harm her. If she is not, then the earth itself will claim her." The villagers murmured. Some nodded with cruel satisfaction, others turned their faces away in pity. A few children clutched their mothers, too afraid to cry out. The girl said nothing. She had pleaded her innocence before, but her words had been twisted, mocked, drowned beneath the tide of accusation. Now silence was her shield. Only the pounding of her heart betrayed her fear. The men pushed her forward to the edge of the pit. The heat lashed at her skin, stinging her eyes with tears. She glanced up just once at the wide circle of faces. Some looked hungry for her downfall. Others were uncertain, ashamed. Above them all, the sky stretched vast and blue, as though even the heavens waited to see what would unfold. "Walk," the elder commanded, raising his staff. She stepped forward. The first touch of fire should have torn her flesh. The millet glowed like coals, each grain a cruel test. Yet instead of blistering pain, she felt only warmth, strange and humming, like the pulse of the earth beneath her feet. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Where her soles pressed, the millet quivered. Then, impossibly, green shoots burst upward through the fire, thin at first, then thick, pushing aside flame and ash. With every step she took, the burning pit transformed into a bed of life. Blades of grass and tender stalks rose high, trembling in the smoky air, their leaves wet with dew no one could explain. The villagers staggered back, some dropping to their knees. The crackle of fire gave way to the whisper of growing things, a sound so soft and sacred it silenced even the stepmother's tongue. She walks with the ancestors," an old woman whispered, her voice trembling. The girl reached the far side of the pit, her feet untouched, her body haloed by the impossible garden that had sprung from flame. For a long moment she stood still, her breath steady, her eyes unblinking. And in that silence, the people understood. What was meant to destroy her had instead revealed a power greater than fire, greater than envy. The trial was over. But the story had only begun. The memory of fire and sprouting millet would forever remain etched in the minds of the villagers. But her story began long before the trial, in quieter days filled with work, whispers, and patience. She had not been born into riches. Her father, once a respected hunter, had died when she was still young, leaving behind only his tools, a few hides, and a daughter with wide, earnest eyes. Her mother followed soon after, and the girl was left in the care of those who saw her more as a burden than a blessing. Her stepmother took her into the household with a smile that fooled the neighbors, but behind the walls of the mud-brick house, cruelty wore no disguise. The stepmother's own daughters grew fat on milk and honey while she was sent to fetch water barefoot on the thorny paths, to grind millet until her arms ached, to tend the goats in the midday heat while others rested in the shade. Yet she bore it all with quiet strength. When scolded, she lowered her eyes. When struck, she did not strike back. When mocked for her worn clothes and calloused hands, she only tightened her grip on the task before her. There was a gentleness in her that no lash of bitterness could erase. The children of the village adored her. Whenever she passed by with a heavy pot balanced on her head, little ones would run at her heels, tugging at her skirt, begging for a story. She always gave them one no matter how tired she was. Her voice, soft and melodic, could turn a walk to the river into an adventure of kings and beasts. She would crouch down to their level, tracing shapes in the dust, lions with fierce jaws, birds with spread wings, until the children squealed with delight. The elders, too, held a fondness for her. She never passed an elder without bowing her head in respect, offering a greeting with warmth that seemed to come from the depths of her spirit. More than once, old women who could no longer fetch water found her at their doorsteps with full gourds, given without request. Old men who had lost their strength to work found their fields weeded, their goats tethered, and always she slipped away before they could thank her. Even the animals seemed to sense her goodness. The goats bleated softly when she came, pressing close as though for comfort. Birds often perched nearby as she worked, their songs weaving into her humming. More than once, a stray dog followed her home, tail wagging, eyes fixed on her as though she carried the scent of mercy itself. But inside her own home there was no mercy. Her stepmother seethed whenever she saw how others loved the girl. "You think their smiles will feed us? You think their praise will clothe you?" she would sneer, snatching away whatever little morsel or gift the girl was offered. The daughters echoed their mother's cruelty, tugging at her hair, mocking her patched dress, calling her names meant to sting. Still she endured. She found moments of joy in the simplest things: the cool splash of river water on her face, the laughter of children, the soft glow of fireflies at dusk. She had a heart that bent but did not break, one that absorbed pain yet continued to beat with hope. Her beauty, though unadorned, was undeniable. She did not need jewelry or fine cloth. The sunlight itself seemed to cling to her skin, and her eyes shone with a quiet light that made others pause. This, too, fueled her stepmother's envy. How could a girl clothed in rags shine brighter than daughters wrapped in beads and silk? How could a child of loss carry herself with the grace of one born to queens? And so, the stepmother's heart hardened. Where others saw a blessing, she saw a threat. Where others saw innocence, she saw a shadow over her own ambitions. Day by day, she plotted not just to humble the girl, but to erase her, to grind her spirit down until there was nothing left. But the girl, though humble, carried something within her, something no cruelty could smother. She did not yet know it, but the same earth that would one day sprout beneath her feet had already begun to whisper its secret strength into her soul. For now she was the humble daughter, gentle, hard-working, and kind. But even in humility, seeds of greatness lay buried, waiting for fire to awaken them. Envy is a seed that grows quietly at first, hidden beneath polite smiles and whispered words, but once it takes root, it twists into thorny vines that choke all reason. In the girl's household, envy grew like a creeping weed, fed by every kind glance she received from the villagers, every quiet blessing spoken in her name. Her stepmother was its gardener. It began with small things. Whenever the girl returned from the river with children skipping around her, her stepmother's lips would tighten, her eyes narrowing. When elders at the market asked after the girl's health before inquiring about anyone else, the stepmother would force a smile while her hands clenched into fists. Even the way animals seemed to follow the girl ignited something dark in her heart. "She bewitches them," she muttered once, watching as goats pressed their noses into the girl's palms. Her daughters too picked up the venom. They mocked the girl's patched clothes, her bare feet, her endless chores. But behind their jeers was an unease they could not explain. Why did the villagers look at their stepsister with pity and affection, while they themselves received only cold nods? Why did elders call her blessed, while they remained overlooked? Soon the whispers began. The stepmother, skilled in twisting truth, dropped words like poison into the ears of neighbors. "Have you not noticed," she murmured, "how sickness comes after she visits a home? Or, why is it that milk spoils in the pot when she passes by? Surely there is something unnatural about it." At first, people dismissed these as the mutterings of a bitter woman, but whispers have a way of multiplying. Repeated enough times they take on the weight of truth. When a goat gave birth to a stillborn kid, someone muttered the girl's name. When the rains came late, another suggested perhaps she had angered the spirits. No one could prove anything, but suspicion spreads faster than fire on dry grass. The villagers began to watch her differently, still with affection, but now tinged with unease, as though her very goodness concealed something dangerous. The girl felt it too. Where once she was greeted with open smiles, now she sometimes saw hesitation in people's eyes, a pause before they returned her kindness. She did not understand why, but she carried on, working, smiling, serving, refusing to let their doubts stain her spirit. Her stepmother, seeing the whispers take root, grew bolder. "Purity must be tested," she said to anyone who would listen. "If she is truly as innocent as she appears, let her prove it. Let her walk where only the pure can walk." The idea caught like dry tinder. Tales of trials by fire had long existed in the village's lore, an ancient way to separate truth from lies, purity from corruption. Few had ever dared it, for the flames showed no mercy. Yet the seed was planted, and soon even those who pitied the girl wondered silently, if she is as blameless as she seems, what harm could the fire do? Her stepmother fanned the doubt skillfully. She spoke not with anger, but with the tone of someone concerned for the village's safety. "I do not wish her harm," she said, feigning sorrow. "But if she carries a curse, is it not our duty to protect ourselves? The spirits demand clarity. The ancestors demand justice." By the time the festival season arrived, the whispers had grown into open talk. Groups gathered at the well, at the market, even at the edge of the fields, debating her fate. Some defended her fiercely, reminding others of her kindness, her tireless service, the love she showed to young and old alike. But their voices were drowned by fear, by the unease that envy had sown so deeply into the soil of their hearts. The girl heard fragments of these whispers but kept her silence. Her heart ached at the thought that those she had served with love now doubted her. At night, she lay awake staring at the low ceiling of the hut, listening to the stepmother's daughters giggling about the trial to come. She pressed her hands to her chest, praying to the spirits she had always trusted. "Let truth speak," she whispered into the dark. Outside, the millet fields swayed in the night wind, their grains waiting, their destiny not yet revealed. None could imagine that the fire meant to destroy her would instead awaken something the world had long forgotten. The council met beneath the great baobab tree, its gnarled roots spreading wide like the arms of an ancient guardian. It was here that the village's most serious matters were always judged, where disputes over land were settled, where thieves were punished, where truth and lies were meant to be untangled before the watchful gaze of ancestors. On that day, however, truth was already tangled in the vines of envy. The elders sat in a wide circle, their staffs planted firmly in the earth. Around them gathered the villagers, restless and murmuring, their eyes darting often to the young woman who stood quietly at the center. She wore no fine cloth, no ornaments, only her patched dress, her bare feet dusty from the path. Her head was bowed, but her presence drew every gaze. Her stepmother was the first to speak, her voice smooth, dripping with false concern. "Honored council, we come not to condemn but to seek protection. This girl brings unease to the village. Misfortune clings to her like a shadow. Crops wither after her touch, children fall ill after her visit. Surely the spirits are restless in her presence." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. The girl said nothing, her eyes fixed on the ground, her hands clasped together tightly enough to turn her knuckles white. One of the elders, his beard streaked with gray, frowned. "These are heavy accusations. Have you proof?" Proof was a fragile thing easily twisted. The stepmother gestured toward her daughters, who stepped forward eagerly. "We have seen it," one insisted. When she passed the goat pen, the animals shrank away. "She walks and the wind grows still," the other added, her voice quivering with practiced fear. Other villagers spoke up, some reluctantly, others with certainty fueled by rumor. A man recalled how his wife's milk had spoiled the day after the girl had helped them churn butter. A woman swore her child's fever worsened after the girl came with water. Each story alone was harmless, but together they wove a net of suspicion too thick for reason to cut. The girl finally lifted her head, her eyes steady, her voice calm. "I have done no harm. I have carried water, tended goats, cared for the sick. If your crops failed, it was the sun. If children grew ill, it was fate, not me. I am no witch." Her words fell into silence, but the silence was not in her favor. Fear is louder than truth, and the villagers' fear had already been stirred into a storm. Another elder, leaning heavily on his staff, cleared his throat. "The spirits alone know the truth. We are but men, and men may be deceived. Yet there is a way to uncover it." He gestured toward the pit nearby, where millet grains were often roasted during festivals. His voice deepened. "Let the fire test her." Gasps rose from the crowd. The old ritual, rarely invoked, feared by all, was spoken aloud. To walk barefoot over burning millet was to place one's life in the hands of the unseen. The pure might survive, the guilty never would. The stepmother pressed her hands dramatically to her chest, pretending sorrow. "It is not cruelty, honored council. It is fairness. If she is innocent, the fire will spare her. And if she is not, then we are saved from her curse." Debate followed, but it was half-hearted. A few protested, their voices trembling with loyalty and pity. "She has done nothing but serve us. How can we ask such a thing?" But their words were drowned in the clamor of fear. "Better one girl suffers," others insisted, "than the whole village be cursed." At last, the elder with the staff raised his hand, silencing the crowd. "It is decided. By tomorrow's sun, the pit will be prepared. She will walk across the burning millet. If she is pure, she will live. If she is not, then her fate is sealed." The villagers murmured their assent, some nodding gravely, others whispering prayers. The council had spoken, and the matter was closed. All eyes turned to the girl. The stepmother waited for tears, for pleading, for a collapse that would prove her weakness. But the girl did not tremble. She did not beg. She lifted her chin, her eyes gleaming with something deeper than fear, something that startled even those who pitied her. "I will walk," she said simply, her voice steady as stone. The stepmother's daughters exchanged uneasy glances, for there was no quiver in her words, no trace of panic. Even the council shifted uncomfortably, though their judgment had been spoken. The girl turned and walked away from the circle, her bare feet quiet on the dust. Her stepmother watched her go, her smile small and satisfied, certain victory was near. Yet among the villagers, unease lingered. The image of the girl's calm eyes burned in their thoughts like coals refusing to die. Tomorrow the fire would speak. But already the earth seemed to lean in, waiting. That night the village slept uneasy. The decree had been made, and in the morning the fire would be lit, the millet poured into the pit, and the trial would begin. Families huddled close, whispering their fears, wondering if the girl would burn, or if some greater force would reveal itself. Even those who had demanded the trial found themselves stirring restlessly, unable to escape the image of her calm eyes beneath the council tree. But while the village murmured behind shuttered doors, the girl sat alone at the edge of the fields. She was not locked away, there was no need. Everyone knew she had nowhere to run. The bells of gossip had already bound her more tightly than ropes ever could. So she slipped away quietly and sat in the dust, her arms wrapped around her knees, her gaze lifted to the dark bowl of the sky. Above her, stars scattered like a million eyes. The moon hung low and full, its pale glow painting her face silver. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of earth and distant fires. She pressed her palms together, whispering prayers not for deliverance but for strength. "Ancestors," she murmured, "if I have wronged you, let me perish quickly. But if I have been true, stand with me tomorrow. Let the fire see me as you see me." Her voice quavered, but her heart did not falter. She closed her eyes, and the silence of the night deepened until it seemed to hum. Slowly, dreamlike visions began to bloom in her mind. She saw a river winding through a parched land, its waters dark and endless. She stepped into it, her bare feet sinking into cool mud, and the current carried her forward. In the water she heard voices, low, resonant, ancient. They spoke not in words but in feelings, endurance, patience, renewal. Next she stood in a field of dry earth. Cracked and lifeless, it stretched in every direction. She knelt, pressing her hands into the dust, and when she rose, her palms held tiny seeds. She scattered them across the barren ground. For a long moment nothing happened. Then from the cracks shoots broke through, green, strong, unstoppable. Life sprouting where death had ruled. Her chest tightened as she watched the stalks rise taller than her, swaying gently though no wind blew. She reached out, touching one, and it shivered as though alive, whispering resilience into her skin. Then came fire. She stood in a sea of flame, the world around her blazing red and gold. Yet instead of consuming her, the fire curved away, leaving a circle of cool earth where she stood. From that circle, roots pushed upward, thick and tangled, wrapping around her legs and arms as if to protect her. She was not alone. The earth itself was rising to shield her. The vision shifted again and she saw faces in the smoke. Not cruel faces of envy but kind, weathered ones, the faces of her ancestors. Some she knew only from stories, others she could not name, but all looked at her with a fierce, steady pride. Their lips moved but their voices were inside her head, warm and unshakable. "Do not fear. You are not walking alone. Every step is ours." She woke with a start, the stars still scattered above her. Tears streaked her cheeks, though she had not realized she was crying. She pressed her palms into the earth, feeling its coolness, its pulse, as if the visions had lingered in the soil itself. A wind stirred then, brushing against her hair, carrying the scent of millet and ash. It curled around her shoulders like a shawl, neither warm nor cold, but comforting. She tilted her head, listening, and though the night was silent, she thought she heard the faintest whisper in the grass. "Walk, child." Her fear had not vanished, she could still feel it gnawing at the edges of her mind. But beneath it now was something deeper, stronger, steady as the roots she had seen in her vision. She understood. The trial was not hers alone. She carried the hopes of every woman who had been silenced, every orphan who had been scorned, every innocent who had been accused. She carried the voice of the ancestors, the strength of the earth, the resilience of life that refused to die. When dawn broke, the village would expect a trembling girl, one about to be consumed. What they would find instead was a vessel filled with something they could neither control nor destroy. The stars faded one by one, and the horizon began to glow. She rose slowly to her feet, brushing the dust from her dress. She was thin, weary, barefoot, but her spine was straight, her gaze unflinching. As the first light of morning brushed her face, she whispered one last prayer. "Let them see truth." And with that, she turned back toward the village, ready to step into fire. The sun rose heavy that morning, blazing across the sky like a cruel overseer. Its light turned the village dust into gold and the smoke from cooking fires into faint gray ribbons. But beneath that familiar rhythm of dawn, an air of dread clung to every hut, every path. Today was not like other days. Today the village would gather for judgment. In the center of the square, men had labored since first light. They dug a shallow pit and filled it with millet, grain once meant for nourishment now condemned to flame. The council decreed it should burn until every kernel glowed red-hot, a bed of embers that no foot could endure. As the fire roared, the acrid smell of scorched grain filled the air, mingling with the scent of smoke and sweat. Villagers gathered in a tightening circle. Old men leaned on their sticks. Women pulled their children close, whispering warnings never to cross the council's will. Youths craned their necks to see, their eyes wide with the morbid thrill of punishment. The whole village had come, some out of duty, some out of curiosity, and some, most painfully, out of envy and spite. At the front stood her accusers. The stepmother, her fine cloth wrapped neatly about her shoulders, stood with arms folded and lips curled into a smirk sharp as a blade. Beside her, daughters and kin whispered cruel jokes, covering their mouths as if the trial were a play staged for their amusement. Their laughter slithered through the crowd, low and poisonous. The council elders sat upon carved stools, their faces set in masks of sternness. But even they could not entirely hide the flicker of unease in their eyes. Some wondered if they had done right, condemning one so young to such a trial. Yet none spoke against it now. The verdict had been given, and to doubt it was to doubt their own authority. Then from the path at the edge of the square she appeared. The girl walked slowly, barefoot, her thin dress brushing against her ankles. The dust clung to her skin, and the bells of gossip seemed to ring with every step though no metal bound her. The crowd hushed, all eyes upon her. She trembled, but each footstep was steady, carried not by strength of body but by something deeper, quieter. She paused before the pit, where the millet blazed, glowing with a fierce, unholy beauty. The heat lashed at her face, searing her lungs as she inhaled. The fire snapped and hissed, alive with hunger as if eager for her flesh. The stepmother's smirk widened. "Let her prove herself," she whispered loudly enough for all to hear. "If she is pure, the fire will know it. If not—" She let the words trail into silence, heavy with implication. The council elder rose, lifting his staff. "Child," he intoned, his voice echoing across the hushed assembly, "you stand accused by the word of your kin. You are given this trial to prove your innocence before your people and before the spirits. Step forth and let truth be revealed." For a heartbeat she closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids flickered the visions of the night before. Roots, rivers, ancestors' faces, the whisper of unseen voices urging her on. She inhaled, the scent of smoke filling her chest, and whispered beneath her breath, "Walk, child. Walk." She stepped forward. The crowd gasped as her bare foot met the edge of the pit. The heat was so intense it shimmered in the air, blurring her figure like a mirage. Some turned away, unable to watch what they believed would be her agony. Others leaned forward, hungry for spectacle. She lowered her second foot, and then, with a trembling breath, she walked onto the burning millet. The fire hissed. Sparks leapt upward. But instead of screams, instead of the sickening scent of burning flesh, something else happened. From beneath her step, a faint green glimmer pulsed. Where her foot had pressed, the glowing millet cracked open. Tiny shoots, fragile, impossibly alive, pushed through the embers. The villagers froze, mouths open. She took another step. Again the millet split and tender stalks unfurled, rising defiantly against the flame. The fire seemed to recoil from them, hissing like a wounded animal. Each step she took, more shoots erupted, bright green against the red glow, a garden born in the heart of fire. Children cried out in awe. Elders gripped their staffs, trembling. Some fell to their knees, murmuring prayers, unable to comprehend what they saw. The stepmother's smirk faltered, her face twisting as though she had tasted something bitter. "Trickery," she spat, though her voice cracked. "It must be trickery." But even her daughters shrank back, fear crawling into their eyes. The girl walked steadily across the pit, each step a miracle, each footprint sprouting new life. Her face shone with sweat, her body trembling from heat and strain, but her eyes burned with quiet strength. She reached the far edge of the pit, lifted her foot onto solid ground, and turned to face the crowd. Behind her, the millet was no longer just embers. It had become a carpet of living green, tender plants swaying though no wind blew, roots drinking deep from the ashes. A silence fell so deep that even the crackling of dying flames seemed hushed. Then slowly murmurs spread, first disbelief, then awe, then something close to fear. She is chosen. The spirits walk with her. Not even fire could harm her. The council elders shifted uneasily, their authority slipping like sand through fingers. One of them rose, but no words came, his voice choked by the enormity of what he had witnessed. The girl looked out over them all. Her gaze was not triumphant nor bitter. It was calm, resolute, touched with sorrow. She had not asked for this trial, yet she had endured it, and the truth had revealed itself not in pain but in life. For the first time the stepmother could not meet her eyes. The trial was over. But its echo was only beginning. The moment her foot touched the glowing millet, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Every eye fixed on her bare soul pressing against the emberlit grains, expecting the hiss of burning flesh, the scream of pain, the collapse of a girl consumed by fire. But what came was something no one could have imagined. Beneath her trembling foot, the glowing millet cracked open. The ember-red light gave way to a piercing green, tiny shoots pushing up through fire as though the earth itself had chosen this moment to speak. The flames that had licked hungrily at the grain sputtered and died back, smothered by sudden growth. The crowd gasped as if a great wind had swept across them. Mothers clutched children to their breast. Old men gripped their staffs until their knuckles whitened. Even the council elders, guardians of tradition, leaned forward with wide eyes, mouths parted in disbelief. She took another step. Again the miracle unfolded. The millet split apart, and from its ashes sprouted stalks, green and supple, rising in defiance of flame. The fire hissed louder, writhing like a snake recoiling from her touch, until it vanished entirely, leaving behind not embers, not ash, but living plants swaying softly as though blessed by unseen breath. Step by step she crossed the pit. Each footprint birthed a patch of green, until the once deadly bed of fire had been transformed into a field of life. Tiny blades rustled against one another, shimmering in the morning sun, fresh and vibrant where moments ago there had been only searing heat. The crowd fell silent, so silent that the rustle of millet shoots seemed like thunder. Some villagers collapsed to their knees, whispering prayers, pressing their foreheads to the ground. Others covered their mouths, afraid to even speak. To witness such a thing was to touch the edge of mystery, to see the veil between the living and the spirits pulled back. The girl stood at the far side of the pit, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion. Sweat glistened on her brow, and her hands trembled at her sides. Yet her face was calm, serene, almost otherworldly. She did not raise her arms in triumph, nor cast a victorious look at her stepmother. She simply stood, eyes soft but unflinching, as though she had expected this all along. The stepmother, however, could not hide her fear. The smirk that had curled across her lips earlier was gone, wiped away like chalk in rain. Her body stiffened, and her eyes darted across the villagers' faces, desperate for someone, anyone, to speak, to explain, to turn this miracle into a trick. But no words came. Her daughters pressed against her, whispering frantically, yet even they seemed cowed by the green life spreading before them. One of the elders finally found his voice. His staff trembled in his hand as he spoke, barely above a whisper, "This is no trick of mortals. The fire has been swallowed and the seed has risen. The spirits themselves have spoken." At his words, a ripple moved through the crowd. Awe, fear, reverence, emotions tangled together, heavy and overwhelming. A few villagers cried openly, their tears dripping into the dust. Children tugged at their mothers, pointing at the shoots, laughing nervously as though the miracle were a game. And the strongest men, those who had laughed cruelly when the sentence was first announced, now lowered their eyes in shame, unable to meet the girl's steady gaze. The stepmother tried once more, her voice high and shrill. "It is sorcery," she cried, pointing a shaking finger at the girl. "She has bewitched the fire, cursed the seed. This is not purity, it is witchcraft." But her words rang hollow. For even as she spoke, the shoots continued to sway, untouched by flame, vibrant with life. The villagers turned on her with narrowed eyes. If this was witchcraft, why had the fire not consumed the girl? If this was sorcery, why did it bring forth life instead of death? The council elders rose as one, their faces grim. "Enough," the eldest declared. "The trial was meant to reveal truth, and truth has been revealed. The fire has not harmed her. The millet has grown. No further proof is needed." The stepmother's protests crumbled into silence. She sank back, lips trembling, her skin pale beneath the morning sun. The girl lifted her gaze to the crowd. She did not speak, but her silence carried weight greater than any words. In her eyes was sorrow but also strength, a quiet power that made even the boldest avert their gaze. She had endured humiliation, cruelty, and the sentence of fire. Yet she had walked through it unscathed, and now the earth itself seemed to rise in her defense. The villagers bowed their heads, one by one, until the entire square was bent before her, not in command but in awe. They did not see just a girl anymore. They saw something more, chosen, marked, blessed. When she finally stepped away from the pit, the millet shoots followed her like a trail, bending softly in the breeze. And though no words passed her lips, the miracle itself had spoken. The council, the villagers, the enemies who had plotted her downfall, all had heard. The fire was gone. Life had risen. And nothing in the village would ever be the same again. The smoke had cleared, but the air was heavier than ever. The fire pit, once a place of judgment, now lay blanketed in green shoots that shimmered like jewels in the sunlight. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly, as though the rustle of the millet might speak again. All eyes turned, slowly, away from the girl who had crossed unscathed and toward those who had demanded her trial. The stepmother's lips trembled, her face drained of color. Only hours before she had stood tall, certain of victory, her voice ringing with venom. Now she was a hollow shadow of herself, shrinking under the weight of every gaze. Her daughters clung to her skirt, whispering questions she could not answer. They tied the bells, an old man muttered, shaking his head. They forced her to work like a beast. They pressed the council for this fire. His words hung heavy in the air, and suddenly all the mutterings began. They envied her beauty. They feared her kindness. They are the cursed ones, not she. The whispers spread like wildfire, turning sharper, louder. People who had once turned away in fear of crossing the stepmother now leaned toward one another with suspicion. Fingers pointed, not at the girl, but at those who had dragged her here to burn. The council elders remained still, their staffs planted in the dust, their eyes unreadable. They did not speak, but they did not need to. The people were already unraveling the truth. The miracle had spoken more loudly than any decree. The stepmother tried to find her voice. "You fools," she hissed, though the quiver in her throat betrayed her. "You let yourselves be blinded by tricks. She is a danger to us all." But the villagers did not listen. Even the bravest among them who once laughed at the girl's suffering now kept their eyes fixed on the ground. None dared defend the stepmother. Her words, once sharp enough to sway hearts, fell flat against the wall of silence. The girl herself said nothing. She stood at the edge of the pit, her hands folded loosely before her, her face calm. She did not raise her finger to accuse, nor cry out against those who had wronged her. She simply waited, her silence speaking louder than anger could. In her stillness lay a power undeniable. The earth had risen for her, and that was all the proof anyone needed. An elder finally stepped forward. His voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the crowd. The fire was meant to burn away falsehood. It did not burn her. His eyes swept over the accusers, and they flinched as if his gaze alone scorched them. "If there is guilt here, it does not rest with the girl." The murmurs grew into a wave. Some villagers nodded fiercely, others clutched charms to their chests, muttering prayers that the spirits would not punish them for doubting her. A woman who had once mocked the girl now fell to her knees, begging forgiveness in the dust. A young boy, his eyes wide with wonder, tugged at his father's arm. "She is blessed," he whispered. "We must protect her now." The stepmother's daughters began to weep, their tears streaking down their painted cheeks. One clung to her mother's arm. "It wasn't us," she cried. "It wasn't us." But the words only drew harsher stares, for everyone knew they had joined in their mother's cruelty, jeering at the girl, mocking her pain. The stepmother straightened, though her knees shook. She tried to glare, tried to summon the fire that once gave her dominance. But it was gone. She could not stand against the weight of the millet sprouts swaying in the breeze, each blade like an accusation, each green stalk a reminder of her failure. The girl's eyes lifted to meet hers. For a heartbeat, silence stretched again, and in that silence the stepmother felt stripped bare. She turned away, unable to hold that gaze. The people began to murmur again, but this time the sound was different. No longer uncertain, no longer fearful. It was the sound of judgment shifting, of power cracking, of the guilty revealed. The miracle had spoken, and no denial could bury it. And through it all, the girl remained silent. Her lips did not shape blame, her hands did not point. She had no need. The earth itself had risen as her witness, and the spirits had whispered in green what her enemies had tried to bury in fire. The pit was no longer a place of death but a living garden, and in its shadow the guilty could not hide. The millet shoots swayed though no wind touched them. A hush blanketed the square, heavy and suffocating, when suddenly the air shifted. It began as a faint stir, an unnatural breeze whispering through the crowd, curling dust around bare ankles, rattling the thatched roofs. The villagers froze. Heads tilted upward as the wind grew, circling like an invisible hand stirring the earth. Then came the sound. Low at first, like distant thunder, but soon it grew into layered whispers, dozens of voices speaking in tongues older than memory. Some villagers clutched their ears, others dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the dirt in reverence. The ancestors, an elder murmured, his voice trembling. The guilty ones, stepmother and her daughters, the few who had stirred gossip into flame, staggered back, their faces pale. The stepmother tried to mask her fear with anger, but her lips quivered, betraying the truth. "This is nothing," she shouted, but her words cracked, thin and weak. The whispers only swelled louder, rising like a chorus of judgment. And then, with a hiss like unseen fire, sparks of light rippled through the air above the millet. Tiny flames flickered without smoke, darting like fireflies, dancing along the stalks. Yet nothing burned. The green shoots did not wither, they shimmered brighter as though lit from within. The villagers gasped. Many fell prostrate. "The spirits are here," someone cried. "The ancestors have come." The council elders, once pillars of stern authority, now stood trembling. Their staffs wavered in unsteady hands. The oldest among them lifted his face skyward, tears streaking down his weathered cheeks. "Forgive us," he whispered hoarsely. "We were blind. We listened to lies. We nearly spilled the blood of the innocent." His staff slipped from his grip, striking the earth with a hollow thud, and he sank to his knees before the girl. One by one the other elders followed. They bowed not only to her, but to the unseen presences whose voices swirled above them, voices of ancestors shamed by the blindness of their descendants. The stepmother's daughters wept openly, clutching at their mother's arms, begging her to confess, to release them from the spirit's gaze. But the stepmother stood rigid, her face twisted in pride and terror. She opened her mouth to deny, but her voice caught in her throat as the wind surged stronger, whipping her shawl about her like a banner of disgrace. "You sought her destruction," the whisper seemed to say, though no single tongue could catch the words. "You sowed envy, you stoked lies, you mocked what was pure. And now the earth itself rises against you." The villagers turned, their eyes hard now, no longer clouded by doubt or fear. "They are the cursed ones," someone shouted. "Not her." The word spread quickly, igniting the crowd. "Yes. They tried to kill what was blessed. They are the guilty." The stepmother collapsed then, her knees striking the ground. Her proud face crumbled into desperation. She clawed at the dirt, mumbling excuses, pointing wildly at others, even at her daughters. But no one believed her. The judgment was clear. The girl, standing still as stone at the edge of the miracle pit, did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence had become the vessel of the ancestors' will. She was their chosen witness, the proof of their power. At last, the wind began to die down, the voices fading into echoes. The sparks vanished into the morning sky, leaving behind the trembling millet, green and alive, swaying in the gentle calm that followed. The villagers remained bowed, unwilling to rise until the air settled into peace. When the silence returned, it was heavier than before. No one dared look at the girl with anything but reverence. The elders lifted their eyes slowly, shame etched into their faces. "We were wrong," the eldest said, voice quivering. "We nearly betrayed our ancestors by condemning the innocent. The spirits themselves have spoken against us. We will repent." The people murmured in agreement, heads nodding, shoulders sagging with relief that the wrath of the spirits had not turned on them as well. The guilty sat broken in the dust, shamed before all, their names forever marked by envy and deceit. The girl raised her gaze, her eyes sweeping the crowd. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet sorrow, as though she carried the weight of all that had been done. She turned away from her enemies, her steps light upon the earth, and the millet bent toward her as she passed, as though even the plants bowed to her resilience. The judgment of the ancestors had been spoken. Nothing more was needed. The village square was silent, save for the soft rustle of green stalks swaying where fire had once blazed. The girl stood at the edge of the pit, her figure framed by the morning sun, her face calm but unreadable. She did not look back at her stepmother, or at the council, or at the villagers who now bowed their heads in shame. She simply turned and with quiet grace began to walk. Where her bare feet touched the earth, Millet sprang. Tiny shoots burst from the soil as though drawn to her steps, pushing up tender and green, their leaves stretching toward the light. The crowd gasped, watching the miracle extend beyond the pit. Each footprint she left behind became a seedbed, a living mark that the earth itself remembered her by. Children followed at a distance, wide-eyed, whispering in awe. Some pointed, tugging at their mother's skirts, as if to ask whether they too would sprout green if they walked barefoot. The elders said nothing, for they knew this was no common wonder, but the lingering breath of the ancestors themselves. The girl walked slowly, her head bowed not in defeat but in reverence, as though she listened to voices no one else could hear. Her silence was not empty, it was full, brimming with the weight of survival, with the strength of having endured and risen again. Behind her, the stepmother crumbled, her face buried in her hands. Her daughters wept beside her, but no one reached to comfort them. The people had already turned their gaze from the guilty, fixing it instead on the living symbol who walked away, each step planting truth deeper than any lie could root. As she moved through the village paths, Millet rose like a green river flowing behind her. Doorways sprouted shoots, dust paths burst into tender stalks, even the hard-packed earth of the council square softened to life. The villagers trailed her silently, keeping their distance, not daring to speak lest they shatter the sacredness of the moment. She did not speak either. Her voice was no longer needed. The earth itself carried her story now, whispering through the rustle of stalks, singing in the tremble of new leaves. Wherever her feet fell, justice bloomed. Wherever she walked, purity and resilience took root. By the time she reached the edge of the village, the path behind her was no longer dirt but a corridor of living green, as though the ancestors had woven her a road of life in return for the fire meant to consume her. She paused then, turning her face toward the fields that stretched beyond, toward the horizon where the sky kissed the land. The sun caught in her eyes, glinting like fire transformed into light. She inhaled deeply as though the world itself was new, and then she stepped forward again, leaving behind the only home she had known. The villagers did not follow. They stood in silence, watching her figure grow smaller, framed by the trail of millet sprouting at her heels. They knew she was no longer simply theirs. She belonged to the ancestors, to the earth, to the truth that could not be burned away. From that day forward, whenever the wind rustled through millet fields, villagers would bow their heads, remembering. Mothers told their children, "Be kind, for envy burns. Be pure, for the ancestors see. And never forget the girl who walked through fire and left only life in her path." The stepmother lived on, but never again could she raise her voice. The whispers of the village bound her tighter than chains, reminding her with every harvest of her guilt. Each time the millet ripened tall and strong, people glanced her way and she shrank smaller, trapped in the shadow of her own envy. But the girl, now a woman marked forever by the miracle, became legend. Some said she wandered into the hills, planting life with every step. Others believed she lived among the spirits, her feet still treading unseen paths, leaving trails of green where none should grow. The truth mattered less than the symbol she had become. For in every millet sprout, in every field that fed the people, there was her memory, a reminder that fire cannot destroy what is protected by truth, that envy cannot bury what the ancestors choose to raise. And so the story lived on, whispered at night by the crackle of hearth fires, told at festivals when drums echoed through the sky. They called it the Green Path, the tale of the girl who walked through burning millet and turned flame into life, her every step a blessing, her every footprint a promise that justice and purity would forever root themselves in the earth. Long after her figure had vanished from sight, the millet behind her still swayed in the breeze, alive, eternal, bearing witness. And with each rustle came the haunting reminder, she had walked through fire, and the earth itself had risen to carry her steps.